Ursula von der Leyen cost Europe its most valuable asset, financial trust. The consequence is already visible. Europe's money is no longer treated as neutral. Its leverage is weaker, and the rest of the world, is learning how to move around it. Now, if this feels familiar, it should, because this is not a one-off mistake or a sudden escalation. It's the same pattern Europe has followed again and again, where decisions made for moral optics today quietly hollow out structural power for tomorrow. And this moment didn't begin on a battlefield. It began with a simple signature. Because when Ursula von der Leyen pushed the European Union toward turning frozen sovereign assets into a political weapon, she presented it as strength, as accountability, as resolve, a message that aggression has consequences. And politically, it did work. Headlines applauded. They loved the move. European leaders congratulated themselves. And the image of unity held, very briefly though, because underneath all those applause, something far more important fractured. Because for decades, Europe's real power wasn't military, and it wasn't necessarily ideological. It was a sense of trust. Money parked inside Europe was boring, it was predictable, and politically inert. Central bank reserves held in European institutions weren't leverage, they were neutral ground. Like storing valuables in a vault that didn't care who you were, only that the rules were followed. And that neutrality was Europe's quiet advantage. Now, von der Leyen, she ended up gambling all that. She treated Europe's financial system like a rental car, something you could push hard for immediate performance, drive around the curves and barely wreck, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be there when the engine fails. Now, that moment, the moment asset safety became conditional, that's the moment the vault stopped being a vault and became a political pressure point. And once money becomes pressure, everyone starts planning exits. And here's the part most coverage misses. The damage didn't arrive with a crash. It arrived silently, because reserve managers, they don't panic. Sovereign funds, they don't issue press releases. They just do math. They just do arithmetic. Because if you discover the lock on your front door can be changed without warning, you don't argue about intentions. You install a second lock. And then you probably are going to start quietly looking for another house. And that's exactly what began happening across this global south and among non-aligned states watching Europe's move here. Because von der Leyen's decision rested on a fatal assumption. And that assumption was that Europe's financial dominance was permanent, that enforcement could be tightened without consequence, and that no viable alternatives existed. And that assumption, it expired the moment alternatives were already in place. Now, she was playing chess as if the board still had walls, while the rest of the world had already realized the game was open. Now, Russia didn't need to escalate militarily. China didn't need to announce a new order. They didn't need to win. They only needed to exist as options. Because the instant Europe taught the world that custody depends on political alignment, the lesson traveled everywhere at once. Never store your oxygen tank in someone else's house. Now, that realization hit hardest outside the West. Countries with no stake in Europe's moral crusade suddenly understood something really uncomfortable. If Europe could redefine property safety once, it could do it again. And the next time, it might be them. And this is how systems actually shift, not through explosions, but through a learning process. Trust behaves like pressure in a dam. Cracks don't announce themselves. Water simply finds new paths. And once those paths exist, you don't get to command the flow anymore. And here's where judgment matters the most, because this was not ignorance. Ursula von der Leyen was not unaware of these risks. Legal warnings existed. Alternatives existed. The option to freeze assets indefinitely as leverage rather than crossing into precedent, they all existed. International mechanisms could have been pursued. Negotiated off-ramps were available. Those options were dismissed because optics pays immediately. Durability ended up paying much later. So she chose the applause of the moment over the stability of the system. And that's not cartoon villainy. It's a form of institutional selfishness, the kind that looks responsible in press conferences and corrosive in hindsight. Now, Europe still has a functioning financial system, but one that no longer commands reflective trust. It's like a credit card that technically works, but every merchant pauses before swiping. Nothing has collapsed yet, but every transaction carries some form of hesitation. And hesitation is how power drains. So the real winners here aren't Europe's adversaries in the traditional sense. The winners are the alternatives: new custody arrangements, new payment rails, new reserve strategies, new systems that don't require permission from Brussels, Frankfurt, or Washington. And this is where the hero ends up emerging, not in a single leader, but in those who recognize patterns before headlines. Governments and institutions that learned the lesson early didn't need speeches or sanctions to motivate them. They simply adjusted quietly, rationally, permanently. Because power, after all, works like gravity. You don't need to announce it. You just need to step out of its pull. Europe didn't lose influence because others attacked it. Europe lost influence because it taught the world how fragile its neutrality really was. And once neutrality disappears, leverage inevitably follows. So the tragedy isn't that this decision was immoral. The tragedy is that it was completely unnecessary. And this outcome was always going to follow the moment custody became conditional. The only question was how long it would take for the world to act on this lesson. So now you can clearly see the trap. And once you see it, you start noticing where it appears next. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the signal flare. So what do you guys think? Do I have this all right? Do I have it all wrong? Please put it in the comment section below. I look forward to reading and replying to all your guys' comments. And thank you again so much for watching me here on The Baseline.